Hello, and welcome to this webinar on the eve of the 6th International Summit on the Teaching Profession. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, is joining us from Berlin, which is the site of this year's summit. He'll be outlining the issues that will be discussed by education ministers, teachers, and union leaders who are participating in the summit, and then he'll be available to answer your questions. Please feel free to send your questions to Eric Magnuson using the chat function at any time during the presentation. Andreas?
Thank you, Marilyn. It's the 6th time that ministers and union leaders from the world's best performing and also most rapidly improving school systems come together to raise the status of the teaching profession. I'm going to talk you through some of the issues which they are going to discuss and show you some of the background data that we have prepared for this. Ministers will begin the summit by discussing what is it that teachers need to know and be able to do to make tomorrow's students successful. And we all know that tomorrow is going to be very different from today. A generation ago, teachers could expect what they teach in classrooms is going to last for a lifetime of their students. Today, teachers need to prepare their students for more rapid change than ever before, for jobs that haven't been created, to use technologies that haven't been invented, and to solve all social problems that we just can't even imagine. And the dilemma for educators these days is that the kind of things that are easiest to teach, maybe easiest to test, are precisely the kind of skills that are also easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. You can solve large parts of today's schoolwork in seconds with the help of a smartphone. So if we want our children to become smarter than a smartphone, we've got to look much harder at what we teach and how we teach. And this isn't just about robots taking over whole factories. You can have a car driving for 1,000,000 miles through the dense traffic of Berlin, where we are holding the summit, without an accident. And we've got to think about what is this going to do to thousands of lorry drivers tomorrow. Or think about augmented reality. You can integrate the world's most advanced knowledge into what you do in real time. And again, that means the world no longer rewards people just for what they know, but for what they can do with what they know. And there's a lot more to come that ministers and union leaders are going to struggle with. Or think about some of the social challenges like migration. Everyone wants to live in wealthy countries. Our world is becoming far more diverse, and that means classrooms are becoming far more diverse, and that means we expect teachers to embrace that diversity with an ever wider range of pedagogic practices. In the past, education was about teaching students something, and that something could be sort of pre-canned by governments. But now it's about making sure that students develop their own compass and the navigation skills that help them to find their own way through an increasingly complex, volatile, and ambiguous world. That means modern curricula need to integrate knowledge, of course, skills, and how we can use what we know, but also character qualities. Educational success is not just about what we know and can do, but it's also about things like mindfulness, resilience, curiosity, courage, leadership, ethics. Those are the kind of issues that are on the minds of ministers and union leaders. How to make it happen? What does it mean for our teacher preparation? You know, what makes this topic so interesting is that the approaches to teaching, and perhaps even what good teaching is widely varying across countries. I'll give you an example. British teachers, for example, tend to hold a quite constructivist belief around teaching. 96% of teachers say, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. Our Thales survey also showed, 86% of teachers say that students learn best by finding solutions on their own. And 74% say that thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. So that's what British teachers tell us. But let's compare that with what actually happens in classrooms. we ask students in our PISA assessments about the prevalence of different approaches to teaching and learning. The oldest learning strategy is probably memorization, just absorb knowledge. At the top of this chart, you find a lot of rehearsal, routine exercises, drill, practice, and so on. At the bottom, that rarely happens. Now you would imagine that if British teachers all believe in a constructivist approach, you'd find Britain at the bottom of the list with very little emphasis on memorization. But the bottom place is already occupied by Switzerland. And then comes Poland. And then comes Germany. No Britain. So where does Britain actually comes out? It's actually the country where students report the most memorization. So think about this. Teachers in Britain say they follow a constructivist approach. The students tell us that their learning experiences are actually rather shallow in the sense that memorization dominates. Now, if I had asked you at the beginning in which country rote learning is most prevalent, many of you might have tipped China, no? But actually, Shanghai in China comes out somewhere in the middle. And the same is true for many East Asian countries, which we often associate with memorization. So yes, those countries do rely on memorization, but actually not predominantly, not as much as Britain and some other countries. In fact, we also measured the prevalence of elaboration strategies. And here you see that, yes, for example, China relies on memorization, but students in Shanghai are also very strong on reasoning, deep learning, critical thinking, and a solution to non-routine problems. And there are other countries too which show that memorization can actually go hand in hand with other learning strategies. And here's another example. Our PISA data show that mathematics is taught quite differently in classrooms around the world. In Iceland, on the very right side, teachers tend to embed simple mathematics in text, and then they ask students to solve lots of those practical problems. And when I was a child, that's the mathematics I actually hated most, because all you needed to do is extract the numbers, solve a simple problem. And interestingly, actually, you rarely see that teachers in Shanghai do this kind of things. There's another way of teaching mathematics, and that's about focusing on conceptual understanding. And again, here you see the opposite pattern. That's where Shanghai puts much greater emphasis than Iceland. You can see the countries on the opposite side. Why do I show you this? Because this tells you that differences aren't about, teachers' genes, but about outcomes of policies that reflect what we believe good teaching is and how we prepare our teachers. It can be hugely different across countries. That makes this international dialogue so interesting. Now, how do those different teaching styles relate to outcomes? Here's some interesting data, again, from our PISA mathematics assessment. So you can look at the PISA levels of proficiency from very low to very high. Now, at the right side, at the green side, students demonstrate advanced mathematical thinking, reasoning skills, and so on. So when you look at student-oriented practices, so things like group work or individualized assignments, we see that's actually happening mostly at the lower end of the performance spectrum, less so at the upper end. Teacher-directed learning, here marked in violet, is much more common across the whole range of the performance spectrum. And when you look at the top end of the performance spectrum, that's where cognitive activation is prevalent. That's about giving students challenging tasks, asking them to think through different solution strategies and apply knowledge to novel situations. What this shows us is that teaching isn't about one way of teaching versus another, and things like teacher-directed instruction that some may consider very traditional can actually be very modern and very effective. The point is that we should take ideology out of the classroom and equip teachers to embrace diverse student needs with a broad repertoire of pedagogical strategies. What this means is that teachers need to develop a wide range of expertise. Effectiveness will always be evidenced by teacher behavior. We are looking for teachers who are passionate, compassionate, thoughtful, who have a really deep understanding of the content they teach, who are capable to deploy a moral pedagogical craft, and increasingly so, teachers also need to become more and more sensitive to different cultural and social contexts of their students. The refugee crisis in Europe has brought that aspect home to many countries around here. Our PISA data show, for example, that the country where migrants go to school matters a lot more than the country where they came from for their performance, because of the incredible contribution that teachers make to integration every day. Here on the chart, you see the learning achievements of first-generation immigrants from Turkey in a group of countries. And you see they show quite similar levels of achievement. But if you look at the children of Turkish immigrants in the upper part of the chart, who've gone to school in their host country from day one, you see suddenly their performance there is a lot. First-generation immigrants from Turkey do similarly well in Germany and Switzerland. But in the second generation, the children are almost a school year ahead in Switzerland. So even if the country of origin does have some influence on student learning outcomes, the country of the next destination matters more. Here's another way of looking at this. Immigrants from the Arab-speaking world do quite well in the Netherlands, but much less well in Denmark, Finland, or Qatar. That's academic integration. But the picture looks quite different when you look at social integration, which is another important aspect of teacher policy and practice. Now, Finland does so-so with academic integration of refugees and immigrants, but it does really well on social integration. Denmark does so-so on academic integration and really poorly on social integration. Again, it shows us how much impact teachers and teacher policy can make. The bottom line is that good teaching is about making learning central, encouraging engagement and responsibility, being acutely sensitive to individual differences, providing continual assessment, being demanding for every student, and ensuring that students feel valued and included, and that learning is collaborative. So what policies can help? That's going to be the topic of the second session of Ministers and Union Leaders. Developing teaching into a profession has many dimensions, and they need to address many challenges. At the level of students, it's about initiating and managing learning processes. It's about responding to learning needs of individual learners. It's about integrating the worlds of formative and summative assessments. At the level of classrooms, it's about teaching heterogeneous classrooms, emphasizing integration of different fields of knowledge through cross-curricular activities, working with students with special needs. And at the school level, we expect teachers not just to work in isolation, but to work and plan in teams and together with other schools and other communities, to reach out to communities, to reach out to parents, to evaluate and plan for improvement. Huge amounts of challenges. Developing this means about recruiting the right people into the profession, supporting them in their continued development, recognizing great teaching, and building pathways for personal and collective. And it's to do with improving the status of the teaching profession. That's always sort of a big underpinning part of this. Of course, whom you attract in the teaching profession matters a lot. Here you see the middle half of the skills of college graduates across countries. And the red part shows you the average teacher in terms of the numeracy skills. So you look at Japan or Finland, and you see they have the highest skill levels among college graduates, plus they're able to attract teachers from the top end of the graduate distribution, on the right side of the graduate distribution. Norway has quite skilled graduates too, basically like Finland. But it's not able to attract its teachers from that upper end of the teaching distribution. Teaching seems to be less attractive in Norway. And if you look at Poland at the end, the skills of graduates are not so strong, and teachers tend to come from the lower end of the distribution. Well, But that's only one aspect. Keep in mind that Poland is one of the most rapidly improving education systems. And that tells us, yes, it matters whom we attract into teaching. But it matters more what opportunities we provide for teachers to develop. And that's such an important theme of this summit. If ministers are just waiting for a spaceship that is going to bring them new teachers one day, they're going to be there for a long time. Some people say, investing in teachers and then see them leave the profession is bad. Yeah, but it's surely worse not to invest in teachers and keep them. People typically define professionalism as the level of autonomy and internal regulation in an occupation. How do we distinguish, profession from a more industrial work organization? It's about whether people work mainly through external forces exerting pressure and influence inward on them, people are working in an assembly line, or whether work is driven by internal motivation and efforts of the members of the profession itself. That's a fundamental sort of differentiator of a profession. So we've tried to measure those drivers in our Tallis survey. We looked at the knowledge base that teachers have, at teachers' decision-making power over their work, and their opportunities for exchange and support. And what the results show is that these play out quite differently across countries. Poland is quite strong on all three dimensions. Now, the red triangle you see here is even and large. Portugal is rather weak on everything. The triangle is small. Malaysia, strong on peer networks, but weak on autonomy. Italy is interesting. Teachers can do what they like, but their knowledge base is quite weak and they tend to work in isolation. France is doing well on knowledge, but teachers don't have much discretion over their work and little access to their peers. So now when you put those countries next to each other, you can see how professionalism plays out so differently across countries. And that tells us how much of a difference policy and practice can actually make, how we frame the teaching profession varies hugely across countries. So what we did, being the OECD, we scored countries on these three dimensions by adding up knowledge, autonomy, and peer network aspects of professionalism. And you can see there are big differences in teacher professionalism across countries. Estonia, Singapore, New Zealand do really well on professionalism. Now, does it really matter? Yeah, teacher professionalism actually tends to relate to PISA outcomes, as you can see on this slide. Perfectly, some relation. But it's also related to other important outcomes. We try to measure some other dimensions as well, the status of the perception, to what extent do teachers see their profession valued. And we know that this varies hugely across countries. In some countries, in Finland and East Asia, teachers are highly valued by society. In France, only 5 in 100 teachers see themselves as valued. Satisfaction with the profession. We looked at teachers' report on the extent to which they are happy with their decision to become a teacher, their satisfaction with the work environment, and most importantly, their own perception of how much their capabilities can actually make a difference, self-efficacy. So, what you can actually find is that teachers with a low degree of professionalism, in red, are generally in the bottom half of teachers with regard to their perception of the status of teachers, their job satisfaction, and their sense of self-efficacy. In contrast, teachers with middle or high degrees of professionalism tend to be around the top third of those who see their profession valued, are satisfied with their profession, and see themselves as making a difference. So professionalism plays out in very, very important ways. But let's go back and have another look at how countries came out on professionalism. Many people consider Finland as the El Dorado of teachers, and I'm a great fan of the Finnish education system too, but even Finland can learn from other countries when it comes to teacher profession. Why is that? Finnish teachers do quite well on knowledge and very well on autonomy. The red segment is quite large. But actually, They are much less engaged in peer networks than other countries. That's the green bar. You contrast this with Shanghai. This is where peer networks are the major strengths of the system. And peer networks are also the main differentiator of Finland and Estonia. That brings us closer to what policy can do about it. In Shanghai, Singapore, England, for example, induction programs, getting teachers integrated into their profession, are universally used. In Finland, they're typically available, that's the red dot, but actually much less frequently deployed, that's the green dot. Or look at professional collaboration. In most countries, you see a fair amount of informal collaboration among teachers. That's on the left part of the slide. Teachers generally tend to be very social people. But the kind of deeper professionalism that we are talking about at the summit is still quite rare across countries. Now, the percentages get very, very small when you think about team teaching, collaborative professional development, or classroom observation. But, again, Shanghai stands out as a system with a strong tradition of professional collaboration. And that is true for collaborative professional development, even more true for classroom observations. Now, teachers in Shanghai would typically teach 10, 12 hours a week, but they spend a lot of time learning with and from other teachers in other teachers' classrooms. Teachers in Singapore will spend 100 hours a year in learning, much of which in professional learning communities at their school. Teachers in Japan prepare and evaluate the lessons together. And whenever these countries have to make a choice between reducing the size of their classes or investing in the profession, they go for the latter. When I visited Shanghai last, I had a look at the digital platform for knowledge creation. You can upload your lesson plans there, and the more other teachers use your lessons, comment on them, criticize them, improve them, the more you will gain in status in the profession. And at the end of the school year, your principal will not just ask you how you taught your own students in your own classroom, but how you helped your colleagues grow in their professional careers. This is what I mean with this kind of professional networks. You compare that with Finland, there actually such professional collaboration is quite rare. And again, professional collaboration matters. The more frequently teachers say they jointly teach in a class, the more they observe other teachers' classes, the more they engage in professional activities, and the more they take part in collaborative professional learning, the more they are satisfied with their own careers, and the more effective they feel in their teaching. School leaders can make a big difference too. In most countries, principals say they provide staff with opportunities to actively participate in school districts. Even though, when you look a bit deeper, you're seeing that actually on average only about a third of principals strongly agree that there is a collaborative school culture characterized by mutual support. There's a lot more that countries could be doing. But the picture looks even more mixed when the involvement of parents and students is concerned. You see that here by the violet and orange bar. But, systems like Latvia, Shanghai, Poland, they're actually doing really well on most of those aspects. Teachers generally feel that professional development has an important impact on them. Over 2/3 of teachers who took part in professional development to strengthen their subject matter knowledge over the last year actually thought that had an important impact on their teaching. It's not, evenly distributed across different areas, but certainly when you look at knowledge, pedagogical competencies, student evaluation, and assessment practices, there's a lot going on, and a lot of that seems to have a real impact. So one thing is to know what policies and practices matter, but really the toughest part of our summit here and most difficult discussions will be around how we actually make good things happen. There's certain things we can sort of assume. What is very, very important is a shared vision and clear and consistent priorities that extend across governments and across time. Easy to say, hard to do. Most ministers that are sitting here are knowing this. The best possible scenario is that your successor will earn the credits for the hard work you did. The worst scenario is you get yourself into trouble and nothing is going to happen. So there's very little actually that people currently in their seats are going to sort of benefit from. Cost and benefits of reform is very important. It makes it so important to have a shared understanding of what reform is about that goes across government cycles. That's what the Nordic countries in Europe are doing really well. Performance management is always essential, and that includes appropriate targets, good real-time data, incentives to align success with targets. Nothing will ever work without investing in frontline capacity. This is about building professional capabilities. It's about transferring and sharing best practice and innovation. And it's about managing human resources. And last but not least, it all needs to fit together in a good delivery architecture. And that is about leadership at every level of the system, including teacher leadership. And it's about consistency of focus and prioritization. Education reform is always difficult. Everyone supports educational reform, except for their own children. Everyone has participated in education. Everyone has an opinion about it. And implementation is so difficult to coordinate across all these layers of the system and the red tape and all the jurisdictions involved. And the fear of loss of privileges matters a lot in reform, simply because the vast structure of established providers implies such extensive vested interests. Very hard to change. It's no surprise that educators are going to do everything to maintain the status quo. But education can and should be doing better. The lack of coherence in reform across successive governments and the fact that only 1 in 10 reforms tends to make any serious attempt to gauge impact. It's probably a lack of respect for taxpayers and educators at the front. Should be doing better. There are also some basic features of reform that students, parents, educators should take for granted. They include clarity about purpose and intended outcomes at every level of the system. They include clarity about methods and reform delivery. There should also be some means of public accountability, that is, transparency of when and how judgments are going to be made, of whether implementation remains on track, and what are the contingency plans when the results don't materialize. And following education reform over the last 20 years, we have sort of drawn 6 broad lessons on policy implementation. The first is to strive for consensus about the aims of reform without compromising the drive for improvement. That means acknowledging, first of all, that there are divergent views and interests. Figuring out what they are, what's the lie of the land, is crucial for any success. And you can never over-communicate. In fact, you can significantly reduce the likelihood of strong opposition through feedback that allows legitimate concerns to be taken into account. I've been impressed how state education agencies in the US, for example, supported school districts in seeing through the American Race to the Top program. That's a great example. Involvement of stakeholders cultivates also a sense of joint ownership over policies and helps build consensus, both about the need and also the relevance of reform. Mechanisms of regular and actually institutionalized consultations are also important to develop trust among parties and help them reach consensus. Denmark's Council for Evaluation and Quality Development, that we discuss in our background report, provides a great example for how you can assemble governments, unions, parents around something as controversial as evaluation. Finally, external pressures can build a compelling case for change, figuring out when those arrive. The second lesson is to engage teachers not only in the implementation of reform, that's easy, but actually in the design of reform. Policy can encourage that through leadership development strategies that create and sustain learning communities, building professional learning into inspection and accreditation, linking evidence of commitment to professional learning to performance-related pay, recertification, providing seed money for self-learning in school, and also professional self-regulation through processes and organizations that include teachers. The Teaching Council in Ireland is a great example for this, and also Sweden is a country where we can all learn a lot from in this respect. Policy experimentation can prove powerful in testing out policy initiatives. Because, those experiments are limited in their scope, they help to overcome fears and resistance. Backing reforms with sustainable resources is always central. It's about money, yes, but it's more importantly about professional capacity and support. Timing and sequencing. We need to acknowledge that it's rarely possible to predict clear, identifiable links between what we do and what we get. The time lag between the time at which the initial cost of reform is incurred and when the results materialize is very big. So everyone needs to develop realistic expectations about the pace and nature of reforms, even if that is very hard in the heat of the debate. It's also time needed to learn about and understand the impact of reform, to build trust, to develop capacity, to move on to the next stage of reform. And last but not least, success is about building partnerships with education unions to design and implement reform. Again, putting the teaching profession at the heart of reform does require a good dialogue between governments and unions. Teachers shouldn't be part just of the implementation, but must become part of the design of change. And last but not least, conflict is best addressed not by weak unions, but by strong social partnerships. It's all easy to say, hard to do, but exactly that's why ministers and union leaders are here in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. We have a few questions for you. The first is, if teachers themselves want to introduce some kind of reform, whether it be in the type of content they're teaching or in the practice of doing so, what would be the best way of introducing reforms? What would be your suggestion for the first step teachers should take?
It varies a lot across countries. In some countries, there's actually a great openness in school systems about teachers taking initiatives. School leaders are actually very supportive for innovation. In other countries, that's much harder to do. You could see that in the slide on the relative degrees of teacher autonomy. In some countries, that is very, very high. Teachers are seen, as the game changers, as innovators in the system. In other countries, it's much harder to do. But overall, one thing we can say is that often the perceived space for innovation, what teachers think they can do, is much sort of less than the actual space. So often teachers and school leaders are not even using the possibilities that they have for real change. The second point I want to make is that it's very hard to pursue change and reform in isolation as a teacher. Building strong networks of professional collaboration can become a very, very powerful lever for change. And this is something where we can learn a lot from countries like Japan, like Singapore, like systems like Shanghai, where there is a strong culture of sort of collaboration. There are a lot of, collaboration, competition. Teachers would observe other teachers' classrooms, work with other teachers to frame the lessons. There's a lot going on, and I think that shows actually how teachers can become the promoters and innovators in the system.
Thank you. Another question we received is, how can teachers best support low-performing students?
Very good question. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that most education faces. In fact, when we ask teachers about their needs for professional development, that typically came out as number one. Engaging with the diverse needs of students, supporting students in great difficulty. And it's not about, taking those students out, putting them in special classes, putting them in special schools. Actually, what we see in the highest performing countries, they're highly integrated, these education systems. And basically, what teachers in those systems do, they're capable to embrace that diversity, this differentiated pedagogical practice in the same classroom. That implies a lot of training, a lot of investment, and it also requires time outside the classroom. Finland, for example, spends about 30% of instruction time outside the classroom. So teachers teach all students, but they have a lot of room in other ways to actually engage with those students who need better support, or students who have particular talents. It is working actually at both ends of the performance spectrum.
Thank you. If government does not offer professional development for teachers, what can teachers do to have professional development activities made available to them?
Well, actually, in some of the highest performing education systems, teacher professional development isn't primarily of sending teachers back to training. Actually, if you look to Singapore, for example, much of the development takes place in professional learning communities in schools. That's principals and teachers who take this in their own hands and who actually try to share and jointly develop good practice. So I think, the teaching profession could learn more from the way high-performing countries, but also other professions organize their way. In most knowledge-based professions, we don't rely on governments. We don't rely on formal training. I think what schools need to provide, what governments need to provide, is a work organization in which professionalization is valued and supported. But to find the best means to do this is probably something that teachers and schools themselves need to play a bigger role. At least that's what we are seeing in some of the most rapidly improving education systems.
One of our participants is asking if you can tell us anything about India concerning this. Do we have any data on India?
Unfortunately not. India is not yet taking part in these global comparisons.
And another participant asks us about how online teaching tools, such as a webinar such as this, are perceived in these different school systems.
Excellent question. I think there's huge potential in platforms for knowledge creation. I mentioned the example of Shanghai, but also, technology as a way to fundamentally change pedagogical approaches to personalized learning, to give students dynamically access to the most advanced knowledge. Huge potential, but in fact, the reality, we have some really good data on this, the reality looks quite bleak on this. In fact, in many countries, in many education systems, technology does do more harm than good. We actually see that the intensity of technology used in classrooms and among teachers is not positively related to learning outcomes. That doesn't speak against technology, but it speaks clearly that we are not using it well and integrating it effectively to leverage better teaching.
One of our participants is asking an interesting question. If there is resistance to reform, either from teachers' unions or from government, how is it possible? How do you create, in fact, consensus in a very difficult, perhaps conflicting atmosphere?
Yeah, that's hard to do. It takes time. It takes sort of an inclusive approach. It means trying to seek and build consensus across society. It's actually very, very hard to do this in political terms only. When you look, for example, at the Nordic countries in Europe that are very good at this, those decisions and those kinds of the platform for consensus goes right across the political spectrum. It's a whole society effort. And we are often missing out on this in education. We make things political decisions that actually should be substantive decisions, that should be driven by expert considerations rather than political considerations. And nobody would, tell engineers, every 4 years how they should build their bridges and their houses and so on. There is sort of a reliance on the profession. We don't yet have this in the field of education. We have too much mingling with professional issues on political aspects, and that's that makes it really, really hard to build consensus. That being said, the teaching profession itself could certainly take a much stronger role in this, and in some countries that's actually happening. I mentioned the Irish teacher councils. Teachers are taking these things into their own hands, building stronger professional networks, and they can be a very powerful tool to create this kind of underpinning and consensus for change.
One of our participants makes a point in saying that teaching approaches and strategies can be often very fuzzy concepts. How do we seek to ensure that the participants questioned in these various studies, and we're talking about Tallis and Pisa here, attribute comparable meanings to them?
Yeah, good point. What we're trying to do is operationalize those constructs. So we basically use anchoring vignettes that basically, we don't ask, are you using a constructivist approach to teaching? That would not be meaningful. But we're basically asking teachers whether they exhibit certain practices and behaviors and certain beliefs, quite specific, and then we deduct from this comparable indices. The same at the level of students. We don't ask them, you use memorization or elaboration strategies. Most students wouldn't have a clue what that means. But we ask them, how frequently does your teacher ask you to do this and that? And then we build those kinds of indices.
Another participant asks a question of character qualities that you mentioned earlier. How do we know which qualities we should be focusing on, and in fact, how can they be developed?
Good question. I don't have an answer for this, but the search for the answer should be a major undertaking in education. Everyone will tell you that it's those character qualities that are a very, very important differentiator for success today. In fact, when you look at elite schools, what is their main differentiator? It's not about, being a bit better on math and science or history and so on. It's often about precisely those character qualities. Figuring out, what those issues are, how to sort of operationalize them, to what extent, what's the role of teachers, what's the role of parents, of students in developing those character qualities. It's a very difficult discussion. All I think what ministers and union leaders can do at this summit is, in fact, put this issue on the map. We have in the past tended to sort of shield it away, basically say, well, that's something that isn't really easily defined, measured, and therefore you're not making it part of the school system. But that really no longer works. Employers, society does expect those character qualities from a good education system. Marilyn, I can't hear you. Now it's back, yeah.
Hello, sorry. We have just a couple more questions for you, Andreas.
Yes. Yes.
How do you convince education authorities on the importance of pilot projects when a lot of times the authorities are under intense pressure to show results as fast as possible?
There's always a tension between speed and implementation. At the very same time, in most other fields of our societies, when we want to achieve big changes, we've got to be sure that the kind of strategies and practices that we have in place will actually work. And the only way to find out is to do some quite systematic experimentation with this. It will take time, but at the end of the day, we have a much more compelling case to make for fundamental change. If we just embark on massive change in education without having really good evidence that the kind of approaches are going to work, we're going to run into huge stakeholder resistance. We're going to spend a lot more time in debate and discussion. And at the end of the day, we're losing impact. So yes, it does take time, but it's a crucial part of success.
Another question we have is, what needs to be done at the pre-service teacher education level to develop the kinds of teachers we want and need now?
Good question. We are currently pursuing a study on this for which the results are not yet available. It is an important part of the equation. At the very same time, over time there has been a shift from what you can do before someone gets into the profession and what you need to do to support them to continue to develop, to continue to advance. I give you an example. By the time the teachers currently in the workforce were trained, they could not have possibly anticipated the role and impact of technology. They could not have possibly anticipated that issues around, migration, refugees might predominate their classrooms. And so in a way, we can less and less prepare teachers for all the challenges they are meeting. There's more and more need for continued professionalization. And teachers are not alone with this. That's true for any profession.
Thank you, Andreas. There are no more questions for you at the moment. Oh, one who's just come in. What do you do when there is not enough, there is insufficient educational resources to provide proper teacher preparation and ongoing training?
Well, that's always a question, the question of resources. At the very same time, we see very little of a relationship between volume of spending in the country and either the quality of outcomes or even things like professionalization. So sometimes very difficult choices need to be made. And one of the things that we see, for example, that high-performing education systems always tend to prioritize professionalization, investment in teachers over things like the size of classes. In the Western world, we have made classes a lot smaller, and that's eaten up a lot of money. And basically, teachers ended up with doing very little beyond teaching. That's not at all the case in East Asia, where actually teachers have plenty of time for doing other things than teaching because they teach in much larger classes. So yes, resources are a question, but we should also be thinking much harder about how we create most value for money.
Here's an interesting question about the learning environment. Do we still need schools consisting of classrooms, or do we need something called learning environments? What is the influence of infrastructure on learning?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I think at the moment most learning is taking place in formal education institutions, but we're certainly seeing a big shift, again, that's where the digital world is providing completely new opportunities for people to decide when they learn, how they learn, what they learn, where they learn, and surely policy and practice should be thinking much more innovatively about designing learning environments that maximize the use of that potential.
Another of our participants asks how we can get out of the vicious circle of poor teacher profession prestige. If the profession is not valued, it is not going to be attracting the best students into the profession, and the vicious cycle continues. How do we break that cycle?
Well, the good news is that some countries actually have seen a rise in the status of the teaching profession. And where that has happened, it's not just been about, doing things like raising teacher salaries, but it's about redesigning the work organization of teachers. If you basically design the teaching profession about, industrial norms, the hours of time you teach, the hours of time, the curriculum and so on, you end up with an industrial work organization. And very few knowledge workers are attracted in that. If, on the other hand, you put much greater emphasis on issues around the profession, you get teachers more involved in, assessment, evaluation policies, curriculum development, curriculum design, pedagogy. You basically make teaching intellectually attractive, like Finland does. Finland is a great example. 9 out of 10, they get basically, they can only give one post for 10 applicants. Everybody wants to become a teacher, not because it's so well remunerated, salaries are just so, but because it's an intellectually attractive work organization. There's a lot more we could be doing, creating career incentives, for example, for teachers to advance their profession, to basically collaborate with other teachers, connect with other teachers. There's a lot governments can do to make teaching intellectually more attractive, provide better career opportunities, and therefore also get sort of the right people into the profession.
We have another question that focuses on Sweden, but actually could probably apply to many other places. The participant notes that teacher shortage is a challenge in many education systems in Europe. Do you think that teacher shortages explain sometimes declining school outcomes?
The quality of teaching is always going to be a main driver. I mean, the quality of education can never exceed the quality of teachers. Teacher shortage is actually, our data don't suggest that it is such a big issue at the moment. It is more an issue that we are not getting the teachers where they can make most of a difference. For example, if you go to disadvantaged schools, that's where you're going to see huge teacher shortage. So I think it's often a matter of how do we attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? How do we get the best principals into the toughest schools? It's about actually mobilizing the talent that we have. And that's an area where I think most education systems, Sweden included, could be doing a lot better.
Another participant asks if we have an example of a country whose learning outcomes are good, but whose teachers' salaries are low.
Actually, you know, Finland would be an example where teacher salaries are average. They are like most other sort of workers with tertiary education, but outcomes are very, very good. But in fact, we don't find that strong of a relationship between the level of salaries and the outcomes. It's basically, you know, once teacher salaries become decent, competitive with, you know, the salaries of other workers with university qualifications, then pretty much other factors kick in. When you have very low levels of salaries, obviously that makes it very hard to keep teaching attractive.
Another question that just came in, do you believe that teachers' evaluation should be made public?
I know it's a question of what the purpose of this. In our analysis, what's most important is to strengthen the link between evaluation and improvement. The most important objective of evaluation is to give teachers better signals of, you know, where their relative strengths and weaknesses are, where they can learn from other teachers. I'm not sure that, you know, public availability of that information plays a sort of very important role in that. At least, and also quite frankly, we don't see many successful education systems that will publish those kinds of outcomes. But I have no data to support this either way.
Okay, it appears we don't have any more questions for you right now, Andreas, so I want to thank you very much. And I want to thank our participants for their interest in the Summit on the Teaching Profession and in the OECD's work on education. As you might have seen in your chat bar, this webinar has been recorded and it will be available in a couple of days on our website, www.oecd.org/edu. Thank you again for joining us.